Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Hunt from the Bullvine. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone here for World Milk Day. And what more fitting practice to do on World Milk Day than how we can improve the milk production? And we're excited to share today's webinar with you. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Matt Utt, who is the Director of Research at Select Sires. And Dr. Utt has had quite a wealth of experience over the years in many different research projects as well as applications of in the fertility avenue. One area that really caught my attention was a research project that he had done in regards to in vitro fertilization and the pregnancy rate or fertility of sires. So certainly a wealth of knowledge, and we're quite thankful that Dr. Utt is able to join with us today. So we do welcome Dr. Utt to be here with us today. He's going to walk us through kind of how we can increase our preg rates and aspects that way. So with that, I am going to pass control over, or control has already been passed over.
All right. Well, it's like I said, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to hide some of this information here. All right. Perfect. Sorry we got started a little bit late, but what I want to do is I want to talk to you about some of the practices that we can work with on farm to increase conception rate in dairy cattle. But I'm not going to just talk about conception rate. I'm going to talk about really increasing reproductive efficiency. And so when I think about this presentation, I thought about the image of this calf, because at the end of the day, this is what we're trying to do, is get a healthy calf on the ground. But there are several different things that can change the outcome of this result. And so when we look at the cow, there are various things looking at an individual cow that can affect whether or not this animal will conceive. It could be problems in the transition period, disease that may or may not be associated with the transition period, body conditions, or how much of a negative energy balance this animal is undergoing. We talk about ovulation or anovulation. Is this animal actually cycling? And then other things like locomotion. And this isn't comprehensive by any means, but just to think about some of the things associated with the cow that may affect the outcome of making a calf. But there are also things associated with the environment, such as nutrition, heat abatement, stocking density, and other things that may affect this single cow and may alter not only transition problems, disease state, body condition, but may also affect her ability to make this calf. Now, of course, what I deal a lot with is semen. I'm not going to talk about sire fertility today. It's really a conversation for another time, and it could be a whole presentation. But I'm going to talk a little bit about producing quality product, storage of frozen semen, and then handling, in terms of not only handling when we're pulling the semen or working with the semen in the tank, but also eventually thawing the semen and loading it into the gun. And then finally, we talk about the events leading up to insemination. So, for example, what is the best AI practice, AI technique? But when am I going to perform insemination? Is it going to be based off of heat detection or estrus detection? Is it going to be based on synchronization, or is it going to be based on timed artificial insemination? So really, these are the areas that I'm going to discuss today. So what's the responsibility of the AI organization? Well, I put a bunch of pictures up here of various tools, techniques that we use to evaluate semen quality. Bull studs can differ in the different techniques they use to evaluate semen quality. Traditionally, evaluations of motility post-thaw and morphology, meaning the shape and the sperm cell, are going to be consistent across most studs. But we do vary some in the different tools and the different types of techniques that we use. And in the case of select sires, we evaluate motility, morphology, and we also use a flow cytometer to evaluate DNA stability and viability of the plasma membrane of the sperm cell, and I'll come back to that. But the point is, regardless of the techniques, we use all of this information to make a decision whether or not we want to keep that semen and send that into inventory and then eventually out into the field, or whether that semen will be discarded. And when people talk about maintaining fertility or a good way to boost fertility from the vantage point of the AI organization or the bull stud, this is really the best way to do it. The more and more ways that we can invent to throw away semen, even though that may be one of our most popular bulls, the better we're going to do in terms of fertility, and the better you're going to do at the end of the day. So this is our responsibility. So what I tell folks is that I need to make sure that each straw of semen that leaves select sires has a maximum potential of making a pregnancy for that bull. Now, of course, I already talked about some of the things associated with the cow, the environment, semen handling, all the other things that affect this, but I need to make sure that the product we can produce is consistently a quality product. So the question is after that is, well, how can it go downhill from this point? Let's talk a little bit about how temperature can affect semen motility. So this is unpublished, and this is probably published back in the 70s or 80s, some data that we collected. That was probably about the time I was about 1 or 2 years old, but it still stands. And when we look at the x-axis, we have the y-axis, we have percentage of motile sperm, and on the x-axis, we have temperature in degrees Celsius. And once again, minus 196 would be the temperature of liquid nitrogen, and then increasing from there. Now, I want to point out a specific temperature, about minus 75 degrees, and this is going to be about where the frost line is, and this is a good indicator of the critical temperature zone. So we want to make sure that semen is handled below that temperature, so below that frost line, below below minus 75 degrees. So anytime we get above that, and as you see highlighted in the yellow area, we're going to start to create some damage. And it may not be as obvious at first, but as you increase temperature towards minus 20, the damage is quite severe. So anytime we're handling semen, we have to keep this in mind. It's important to stay below the frost line and stay below that minus 75 degrees Celsius mark. Now, this is just an example of semen exposure to this temperature. Once again, on the y-axis, we have increasing temperature starting at minus 196, once again, in liquid nitrogen, going up to 35 degrees Celsius, which would be about thaw temperature. And notice the critical temperature line at minus 75 is highlighted. So this is what you would think would be really gross negligence in terms of handling semen. There's a long period of exposure past this critical temperature zone. But it may not always be like that. Take this graph, for example. Now, in this case, we have shorter durations of exposure, but more frequent exposures. So what I'm trying to get across in all of this is we want to make sure that we try to keep semen below that temperature and minimize the number of times that it comes up into that range. And it may not be that all sperm are going to be completely immotile or completely non-viable after a brief exposure, but the question is how much exposure over time to that critical temperature or above that critical temperature zone can create a problem, and then ultimately potentially result in a decrease in fertility. So I visited with you a little bit about semen. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about sire fertility, but hopefully understand a little bit about what happens in terms of the product that we produce and how we like to think about handling that product to make sure that we're not inducing damage to the sperm. But what I want to talk about now is what decisions we're going to make to take that product and put that product in the uterus of a cow. So we talk about making pregnancies. Most people would think of a measure of reproductive efficiency as 21-day pregnancy rate. And pregnancy rate is really the efficiency of making pregnancies, and it's based on two other statistics. One of those is submission rate or estrus detection rate. They're really synonymous. And then conception rate. And submission rate means, are we really submitting, what's the efficiency of the animals that should be bred? How many of those animals are we actually submitting to breeding? Conception rate, on the other hand, is the number of animals that become pregnant that we do breed. Let me run you through a couple of examples of these. Take these first two examples. Submission rate is 50%, meaning 50% of the time we're submitting animals to breeding that are eligible to be bred. And we'll talk about eligibility to be bred a little bit later on. In conception rate, this is actually what's changing in this example. We go from a 35% to a 40% conception rate. Notice what happens to pregnancy rate. We increase conception rate, pregnancy rate increases. Now look at these next several examples. Notice that we increase submission rate even to 100%. 100% submission rate would be analogous to time AI, meaning all animals are being submitted to insemination. But notice how we can have different submission rates, for example, with the third and the fifth example, the same conception rate, and that can drive up pregnancy rate. But the last two really really speak towards the relationship between submission and conception rate. We may have a lesser submission rate, but or we may have a lesser conception rate in the final example, but because we have a greater submission rate, we're going to have a greater pregnancy rate. So as I go through this presentation, I'm going to talk about things that are pertinent to submission rate and things that are pertinent to conception rate, and these will change the bottom line at the end of the day. So we need to make that decision to breed the animal. Well, we're talking about submission rate here. Question is how we're going to determine that this animal is in heat or is expressing estrus. The most classic method is, of course, visual observation. This can be done once, twice. As graduate students, I'm sure some of us have measured it several times a day, four times or greater. But what's more common on dairies is we see walk and chalk. I'll talk about that here in a minute. But as we move more towards technology, we even have systems that are automated that can determine when an animal is expressing estrus. And then ultimately we can abandon the need for estrus expression using timed artificial insemination. So the foundation of estrus detection is really the primary sign of estrus is the animal standing to be mounted. Now, if we were talking about a herd of beef heifers synchronized, this would be pretty obvious. But of course, we know in dairy cattle, mounting activity is somewhat reduced than it is in beef cattle. So when we talk about cisterns to detect estrus, they're going to be based on this activity. So one of these is walking or tail chalking or what we call walk and chalk. Now the concept here is to breed once daily to evaluate tail paint that was applied the day before and reapply that tail paint setting as, oh, hang on a second, I got a note here. Let me see if I can turn up my volume.
You're okay. The volume's fine.
Okay, it's okay. Okay, I thought I got a note here. So we can evaluate the tail paint, determine if that animal's been ridden or not, has been mounted, and then we reapply that. So the concept is if you look at the cow that's in the center, the tail paint has been removed, this animal is in fact likely in heat. Whereas or in estrus, when you look at the animal to the right, you'll notice that the tail paint is still intact. Well, as I mentioned before, it's not always that simple. So complete absence of chalk indicates mounting activity, but if the chalk is not completely absent, or some of us would say smoked off, we may need to look for other indicators that this animal may actually be in heat or in estrus. And we call these secondary signs because these are most likely associated with events associated with estrus. These might be, for example, red and swollen vulva, mud on the flanks due to mounting activity from the hooves of other animals. You know, in the case of animals that are really, the tail paint is completely removed, you may see examples of rubs. And then finally, if you breed the animal palpated, there may be mucus, clear mucus, hopefully, that is discharged from the reproductive tract. But by taking several of these signs together and reading that tail paint, we can establish a likelihood of whether we think that animal's in heat. Once again, this gets back to submission rate. The more conservative we are in terms of submission rate, probably the greater the conception rate will be. But if we're too conservative and we maximize conception rate, we may be really creating a problem in terms of pregnancy rate because we're not breeding enough animals. Well, activity systems have decreased the need in some cases for the use of walking and chalking and heat detection. Now, the use of devices to determine whether an animal is in heat goes back to the 1970s. Down here in the far left-hand corner, you'll see a picture of a pedometer. This is from University of Maryland, and I think Dr. Ray Niebel was part of this research, I think, at one point. I'd like to give him a hard time that I wasn't born at that point. It would be a year later. But the point is that we've been doing this for several years. Probably the thing that was one of the greatest advances was in the 1990s, and that was the heat watch system, which is based on whether an animal was mounted or not, which was based on pressure device. It was on the tail head of the animal, and every time she was mounted, we would press a button. So indicative of what we really think of the primary sign of heat, which is standing to be mounted. I did some research with this in Virginia Tech back during my master's. But as we looked at development, we see several systems that are pedometers below the timeline, and then we see some of the systems that Select is marketed that are based on accelerometers. And so this is similar to the technology. I have a Fitbit on right now. And this Fitbit can tell me not only how many steps I've taken, similar to pedometer, but it can also tell me what type of activities I'm engaging in. And because it's not just based on steps, it's based on activity and the swing of my hand. Well, it's the same concept with accelerometers. That's a collar system in the case of Select Detect or SCR heat time, or now the Cow Manager, which is an ear tag based system. So why are we so concerned with estrus detection or detection of heat? Well, the truth is we're using it to predict ovulation. Now, I'm not saying that estrus is not important, because there's some events that occur that can help lead towards that creation of pregnancy in the end that aren't necessarily associated with ovulation, but we primarily use it as an indicator of impending ovulation. So how do we know this? This is a study that was conducted with Dr. Stevenson at Kansas State and some of our team here at Select Sires. And what Dr. Stevenson did, compared the heat watch system, once again, which is based on mounting, kind of a gold standard, to an activity monitor, which in fact was a Select Detect system. So these animals wore a heat watch patch on their tail head to monitor mounting activity, and to a collar system. And the question is when you look at this graph, is when were these animals ovulating relative to the beginning of estrus? So in the case of the heat watch system, we defined estrus, the beginning of estrus, based on the first standing event. So when you look at this graph, what you'll see is on the x-axis, the blocks or periods of time when these standing events were threshold activity levels in the case of activity monitor, and these events were recorded. And then on the y-axis is the percentage of animals ovulating. So just for example, if you go to the period of 25 to 30 hours, that's when the majority of animals were ovulating relative to the first standing event in the case of heat watch or the activity monitor. But it's not a cut and dry situation, right? We have animals ovulating a span of 20 to 30 hours. But for the most part, when we look at this, we have the onset of estrus. The time from the onset of estrus to ovulation is going to be within a 24 to 30 hour period. Different studies have shown around 27 hours, but you're looking basically at a day and some change. So 24 plus about 6 hours or so. One of the things that's interesting to point out is when you compare the activity monitor to the heat watch, it seems like there was actually significantly more animals in that earlier group with the activity monitor than the heat watch. And this may be due to simply the way the activity is monitored. So we know a little bit more about prediction of ovulation. And the question is well, based on that knowledge, what do we need to know about inseminating cattle? So let's look at two different studies. This first study was back in the late 90s using the heat watch system. Several herds were involved in this study, and this graph depicts the time from the onset of estrus, determined by mounting, as I mentioned before, starting from 0 to 4 hour blocks all the way up to about 24 hours. And on the y-axis, we have conception rate. And what you'll notice is you see this kind of broad slope decreasing as you approach 24 hours, which would be the time roughly the time of ovulation. So we were fine earlier on, but as we get closer to breeding the time of ovulation, nearly at the time of ovulation, it looks like conception rate decreased some. Now let's see how that compares to the activity system. Once again, this is from the same study that I just described, where we were showing the times of ovulation for the heat watch and the activity system. And it's broken down into second and first and second plus lactation groups. So in this graph, same concept, conception rate on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have blocks of time relative to the onset of estrus to AI when these animals were bred. So for example, the first group were bred between 0 and 4 hours after the onset of estrus, being the longest time from breeding to ovulation, whereas the animals that were in the 17 to 26 hour block were the ones that were closest to ovulation. We don't see as great of a slope in this graph as we did in the heat watch data, and we see a little bit of a difference in the first and second lactation animals. There may have been some differences. I think I remember reading in this article that there some differences in estrus expression between groups of animals, but the point I want to get across is this: we don't want to be putting semen in right at the time of ovulation. But the truth is that there is some variability and some range. In fact, I remember looking at animals with ultrasound, evaluating ovaries, looking for the ovulatory follicle, and in some instances I've seen that the follicle had ovulated and we bred those animals immediately after. Well, they created pregnancies. So I'm not saying a conception rate is 0 when you breed close to the time of ovulation. Matter of fact, you see that in these data. It just is a little bit less than the more ideal time, which was in that kind of 8 to 16 hour window. And that's kind of true for not only the heat watch information, but also the activity monitoring system. So when it comes to making decisions to breed cows, during heat put semen in the animals. And if you're worried about breeding too close to the timing of ovulation, it's not something I would be very concerned about. You could also, there might be some concern about breeding too early, but the truth is you're going to have a greater probability of making a pregnancy by putting semen in than not at all, if you're convinced the animal is in heat. So this leads us to ovulation synchronization. We learned a little bit about estrus detection and timing of ovulation relative to estrus, and we've when we want to breed those animals. As I mentioned before, we tried to shoot for that 18 to 16 hour window. That looked like the sweet spot. But the truth is we know that herds get along just fine breeding once daily at 24-hour intervals. But let's talk about ways that we can manipulate this. And when you think about ovulation synchronization, this is just a buffet of different protocols that I displayed just to give you an idea that there are several that are out there. And there are a lot of acronyms, and there are a lot of possibilities for confusion. But let's just throw the beef protocols in there as well. These are depicted in red. So if you weren't confused before, let's make it even more confusing. So the question is well, which one do I choose? Which one is best? Well, I'll give you a PhD answer. Well, that depends. And the reason why is it depends on what you're trying to do in terms of your management program and the conception rates you wish to achieve. So I'm really not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. I'm going to refer you to the Dairy Cattle Reproduction Council website. This group is made up of industry, veterinarian producers, and academicians, and they decide on protocols that they think will have the greatest potential for success based on years and years of research. So I want to again encourage you to visit this. There are also great resources available to tell you more about estrus synchronization and reproductive management in cattle. I just want to throw one sales pitch out. We'll be hosting the DCRC conference in Columbus, Ohio this year, November the 10th and 11th. And so please visit the website for more information. And we'd like to see you out in Columbus for that. Once again, great resource to learn more about synchronization and to boil this down to protocols that will be successful, hopefully, in your herd. But what I really want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about controlling synchronization of ovulation and some of the concepts behind that. And in this case, there are two things that we have to do: control the corpus luteum and control the ovulatory follicle. It doesn't matter which protocol you're talking about, we're going to be doing this. And the corpus luteum is going to be controlled by prostaglandin F2 alpha. Some trade names might be Lutalice, Estromate, GnRH, OvSynch, Cisterillin, and so on. But GnRH is what we're going to use to control the ovulatory follicle. So let's just take a couple of examples. When you look at the growth of follicle and CL on the ovaries, and you look at this, which is on the y-axis, and you look at days of the estrus cycle on the x-axis, this is probably a graph that you've seen before. The corpus luteum is present for most of the estrus cycle. But what we have is waves of follicle growth. And so we have waves of follicle growth, and if we were to destroy that CL at any given point, the time from estrus until ovulation, or the time from CL regression to estrus and ovulation would vary considerably. And so we knew this with a single injection of prostaglandin. But what we were also able to figure out is, as we designed some of these protocols, if we use GnRH 7 days before that prostaglandin, what we're able to do is we're able to control follicular growth, we're able to induce a CL, so at this point we're able to control follicular growth much more easily and create a tighter distribution of estrus once we give that injection of prostaglandin. Now, because we're able to really bunch these heats up and bunch follicle growth up, we're able to give another injection of GnRH to induce ovulation. And because of this, we're able to breed to a fixed time or a fixed appointment or fixed timed AI. And this is basically the OvSynch protocol. Now, there are differences in timing of some of these events in terms of the hours that GnRH is given, but this is just conceptually the way this is set up. And I don't want to get into minutia, but I want to point out is how this was developed. Now, one of the things that they figured out was OvSynch doesn't work when it started necessarily at every stage of the estrus cycle. So we went to using a pre-sync method to really set those animals up using 2 injections of prostaglandin. In this case, it would be 14 days apart and then a 14-day period from the last prostaglandin to the GnRH beginning OvSynch. But the whole point of this is to set these animals up so they're more likely to respond to OvSynch and maximize success there. But the truth is there are many protocols, there are several protocols that can do this. Pre-sync, as I just described, G6G, and then you can also preload this with double OvSynch. So the truth is you use OvSynch to set up for maximum success with the OvSynch that you're going to breed to. Once again, visit the DCRC website to learn a little bit more about this. All right, we talked a little bit about events leading up to making that breeding decision, and we're at the point now where we want to breed the animal. So let's talk about the AI procedure. I'm not going to hit all of these points, but I want to talk about the fundamentals that we cover with our technicians and breeders associated with select sires. Thaw temperature and time, we recommend 95 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 45 seconds. I want to make sure that equipment is clean. Semen handling, I'm going to visit a little bit about this. We want to make sure that semen, once it's thawed, it's going to be maintained at 95 degrees. So keep the semen warm from the time that it's thawed till you get it to the cow. I'm not going to visit on this, but make sure the AI gun is prepared properly. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about semen placement, making sure we get semen into the body of the uterus and not stuck in the cervix. So what about thawing semen? We had several folks approach me about alternative methods to thawing semen, and I'm going to talk about 2 studies briefly where we investigated this to see what type of effect this would have on semen quality. Now, I'm not taking this to fertility, but we want to look at what we can measure in the lab in this case. So I took 6 Holstein bulls, and I used 2 thaw methods. So same batch of semen, couple straws per bowl for thaw, actually 3 straws per bowl for thaw method. In this case, we used a warm water bath, 37 degrees per minute. This would be synonymous or analogous to what you would do in the field. And then the alternative method was to air thaw semen in a paper towel placed in your pocket. Now, I do it for 5 minutes, and then I would warm it up immediately before evaluating to 37 degrees. And the reason why is so we can compare apples to apples, because we know if we're at a lesser temperature, the motility will be less. So once again, different thaw methods, but they were both at 37 degrees when they were evaluated. Now, I'm not going to talk about motility. It's going to be really very similar to the data I'm going to present about sperm plasma membrane viability, but I want to show you this. It's just a technology that we use. It's called flow cytometry. It's a very objective procedure, and in this case, we evaluated 3,000 sperm per straw, did a few straws, and then we evaluated the viability of the plasma membrane of the sperm cell. So the concept is if the membrane is viable, we'll stain the cells, and we'll incubate the cells with a stain. If the membrane is viable, then the stain can't get in and stain the sperm of the head cell, stain the head of the sperm cell. On the other hand, if the sperm cell is damaged, that stain in and stain the sperm. So in this case, sperm that stain are non-viable, or I point out here, just dead, and sperm that do not stain are in fact alive or viable sperm. So it's just a little different, but it's going to be very similar to what we see with motility. Let me show you or talk to you about how I describe these data. You notice the blue box up top. Let me give you an example. 70% viable sperm with a water thaw and 35% after we use the alternative thaw method. So this is a 50% reduction in viability. So this is how I'm describing the data, meaning the reduction, and you'll notice that there's a reduction all the way across the board. So there's about a 25% reduction by putting the semen in the strip pocket and thawing it. But what you notice is that there are different types of bulls. There's just one bull, bull 3, that really didn't seem to affect, but bull 2, nearly 50% of the cells were non-viable when you compare it to the warm water, kind of the gold standard. Let's talk about another experiment. In this case, once again, we use 6 Holstein bulls, but we wanted to standardize things a little bit more. This is actually a research intern that worked with us. We had 3 different treatments. Once again, that gold standard of a water bath. Then we simulated a pocket thaw just to make sure the temperature was standardized. We used a warming plate. And then we want to simulate a gun thaw, but not a gun thaw and a gun warmer, but more like putting a gun inside your shirt pocket, so holding it close to your body temperature. And what you see is the actual temperatures that we measured. So the simulated pocket was around 25, 26 degrees Celsius, whereas the gun was a little bit warmer. Once again, we did this for 3 minutes, and then we warmed everything up to 37 degrees to evaluate it. Now, this is the actual percentage of viable sperm, just to show you how these other methods compared to water thaw. And you'll see a reduction with both the gun and the pocket thawing. Once again, pocket and gun being air thawing. But let's look at it again, the way I described it before, percentage reduction. So once again, you get around a 25% between the 2 of them. But when you look at the variation in bulls, once again, you see some bulls tolerate it a little better than others. So the take-home message here is the truth is we probably put more than enough sperm cells in here to tolerate this, but you just don't know which bulls are going to tolerate methods of thawing alternative to what we've been doing for the last 50 years. My biggest concern is that we would use a technique other than warm water thaw, and you might be using several straws of semen from that bull and see a reduction in fertility. So I always like to go with the best case scenario or be conservative in terms of semen handling, so I would always recommend using the water thaw method. Now, when it comes to breeding, just say no to filth. I hope nobody that's listening has a breeding box that looks like this. But can this affect anything? Can a filthy breeding box, can dirty implements that are come into contact with the AI gun or the equipment used to prepare the AI gun and touch the straw, can that make a difference? Well, let's use an example of protected sheaths. So if we use protected sheaths, you'll see here in the left-hand corner the kind of the classic, the plastic tube that's in a roll, or you would have a more of a firm sheath that slides over top of the prepared AI gun. But the question was in breeding, did you notice, was there any difference in the amount of contamination using sheaths or not using sheaths? This is a study conducted by Ohio State. I think there were 25 inseminations in each group. With the sheaths, about 60 to 70% of the animals had some sort of contamination. Without the sheaths, 100% of those 25 did. But what's interesting is when you look at, even though there was contamination with the sheaths, you look at the green, this indicates light microbial growth, whereas the red indicates heavy microbial growth, and so you see a shift. So it would make sense that using sheaths do prevent some contamination. But does this result in increased fertility? So these are conception rate data from this study, and what we're looking at is conception rate overall on the x-axis compared to first service and second service and greater. The red bars indicate the inseminations where the sheath, the protective outer sheath was used, and the gray indicate where no sheath was, protective sheath was used. So what you see is overall there was an increase in conception rate when these sheaths were used. But what we see is this is it's realized in those animals with 2 services and greater. So once again, cleanliness, it certainly can help, and it can't hurt anything. Semen placement. Getting towards the end here, sounds like we got some good questions coming in. That's what Andrew said. Recommend we place semen in the body of the uterus, not in the cervix. But what about this instance of horn breeding? What about if we can palpate a follicle, we can tell that, yeah, on the left side, this animal has a follicle, she's going to ovulate off of that side. So let's put semen close to where it needs to be, right? Let's get it up in the uterine horn, closer to the junction of the uterus and the oviduct, and that should increase conception rate. Well, this is one of those things that in theory should work, but let me show you some data here. These are studies that shown in the green a positive effect using horn breeding. In the middle, there's no effect, meaning it didn't help or didn't hurt anything, and then there was only one study that showed a negative effect. So why would we horn breed? Well, it's probably not going to hurt anything, but it's really probably not going to help out. So there may be potential to damage the uterus as you go further up into the uterine horn. But my take on this, and what I tell people, is make sure you're past the cervix. So If you end up in one uterine horn more so than compared to another animal, then it's not going to be a big deal. So the concept is get the semen past the cervix. Now, what's interesting about this, I didn't put this slide in, but there's some studies where they bred on the opposite side, and some of these were accidental, and where conception rate wasn't affected. So once again, the point is get the semen in the uterus, not necessarily on the uterine horn on the side, or the uterine horn on the side of which ovulation you think would happen. Finally, I want to end this with some information about reproductive management in terms of, we've made all these decisions. We tried to maximize when these animals are being bred in terms of making sure they're bred when they're eligible, but also making sure that they have the greatest probability of getting pregnant when we do breed them. But the question is when do they need to get pregnant? So let's look at this time interval. This is what our timeline looks like. So we have the animal calves from one calving to another. The calving interval, what goes into really regulating that? Well, we've got something that we can't really change, which is going to be pregnancy, about 283 days, let's say 9 months to round it off. We know that we want a dry period of around 2 months. If we lengthen that out, maybe putting on too much body condition score. If we shorten it up, may not have the animal ready for when she's ready to lactate again. So we want to stick with this 2 month and 9 month, things that are really fixed. So the question is what is the time period from when she calves until when she becomes pregnant? So if you look below this on the bottom, I've got another timeline outlining this. On the bottom, we have time and days in milk. So the truth is they're going to begin cycling in the teens to 20s after in terms of days in milk. I just put 21. The uterus is going to be ready. I've always heard uterine involution around 35 days in milk. I just put 40 here to give them a little extra time. Hopefully you see the story I'm building here. So the question is, when are we going to breed them? What's the voluntary waiting period? At what point are we going to decide, all right, we don't want to breed animals before this, but we're ready to start breeding? Well, the truth is a lot of herds today are basing this on lactation number. So we typically would see a first lactation voluntary waiting period of about 70 days in milk, and a second and greater at about 60 days in milk. Well, why is this? Well, first lactation animals, they're going to maybe have some more problems with that transition period and may start to push when they start cycling, when the uterus is ready, whether we're talking about involution or infection or things like that. So it may push their ability to get pregnant out a little bit later. So that's why I want to give them a little bit extra time in terms of voluntary waiting period. But ultimately, we need to know when she's going to get pregnant. And when she gets pregnant is going to be based on when we decide to start breeding her, the breeding scheme that we use, and then finally, the conception rate and submission and conception rate that we're using. So when does she get pregnant? Does that make a difference? I want to talk about in terms of dollars here. When we talk about dollars, this graph depicts economic loss. So actually, you want to have less loss. So we want to look at where these graphs hit the x-axis. So days after calving is synonymous with days in milk. And we have first, second, and third lactation. What you'll notice is that animals that are first lactation, that optimum where that hits the x-axis, where economic loss is minimized, that's going to be greater in first lactation compared to second and third lactation animals. And these are data from University of Florida. But the point is this decision is economically driven. Now, there's some other opportunities to evaluate some of these decisions. I'm going to throw a shout out to the University of Wisconsin and their dairy management website. There are lots of great calculators. Victor Cabrera is heavily involved with this. This is an example of a calculator that he uses to really determine the maximum or the optimal time of making a pregnancy based on inputs such as milk production, cost of feed, dry period, and so on. But I don't want to spend any time on that. We're running short, but I just want to give you some information to look at and investigate that further. Finally, I want to end the presentation with this. Hopefully, you've gotten some ideas about things that probably were old hat, things that you probably knew before, but things that can influence reproductive efficiency. But in the end, you got to monitor this, right? You got to be able to go into your records analysis system, and you've got to, or your herd management software, and evaluate whether you see a difference. So I wanted to throw this fortune cookie or this fortune up here that everything is possible, just not so probable. This couldn't describe my what I deal with any better, and actually I did get this fortune. So let me give you the final example. I don't want to give you any information about my the way I lean politically, but these are actual data, and I just changed the name of the technician. So this is technician conception rate for Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Rush Limbaugh, and Ted Cruz. And a couple different things you'll notice. Bernie Sanders seems to have the lesser of the conception rates, especially when you compare him to Donald and Hillary. I guess it's kind of appropriate because they look like they're the two that are really heading towards the front of the pack, or at this point they are at the front of the pack. And then Ted Cruz would be greater than Bernie, but not by much. So the question is can we assume that these differences are real? Well, the two things you should ask, well, show me what the number of inseminations are. That's what the total indicates, but also what the confidence intervals are around these numbers. And I've depicted this in the table, but also in the graph based on the error or the bars. And so what you can determine from this is really there are no differences here amongst these technicians. Bernie and Ted have the fewest number of inseminations and the greatest range in values that they could potentially take on, which is what a confidence interval is. So my point is make sure that you keep it real when it comes to drawing conclusions from your data. And it's all about probability. Things are possible, but the question is what's the most probable? And with that, it's been a real pleasure visiting with everyone. This is my first webinar. It was kind of interesting. I didn't quite know what to expect talking to a computer, but it's been pleasant so far. With that, I'll open up the floor to any questions.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, we've had quite a few come in. So I will start working them through, but also remind everyone that if you've got your question, please get it through to us as we work through them here. First question that we had is, what would you consider to be the three most critical practices to maximizing your conception rate? Like what three things do you think people need to focus the most on?
In terms of conception rate?
Yeah.
The areas for the greatest opportunity are some of the things that I talked about: semen handling, and estrus detection, and making sure that we're setting up the timing estrus detection, following protocols. If we're not detecting estrus and we're using timed insemination, making sure we have compliance. So we're making sure that when we do make the breeding decision, that we prepare the semen correctly, and we're really getting correct to the timing of getting the sperm and the egg together. And I think the other thing too is what I mentioned in terms of cleanliness. So these are things that can have great impact. And in terms of cleanliness, as I mentioned before, making sure that the things that enter the uterus are clean. And then I guess I'm going to throw one more thing in there is when we talk about reproductive management and setting that voluntary waiting period, we're also making the assumption that these animals are cycling, especially if we're using a timed AI scenario. So in this case, it's really the things I discussed. It's about semen handling. It's going to be about making sure we're making the right breeding decision, and then cleanliness.
Okay. Next question is, what are some of the common mistakes or some of the common practices that when you go onto herds or see people who are doing the inseminating doing that almost make you cringe or really kind of make you wonder that you think, why are you doing that, or how is that going on that you would recommend people to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And some of the things that, let's see, one of the things that's kind of interesting, we talk about, and this is a semen handling post-thaw and post-gun prep. One of the things that comes to mind is the gun warmer. Great device. Incredible device, actually, because now we can maintain semen basically in the same temperature that we'd have in the water bath. But one of the problems that I have seen with that is cleanliness. So what will happen is if you were to open up the cover of that gun warmer and look down into the bottom of where the tips of the A-guy gun is residing, you would see some semen that's left over that's spilled out. There may be some manure from other sheaths, other AI guns that were put in there, and so there's a potential contamination factor. We discussed that in the presentation, but this is a real opportunity. One way to get around that is to put a sleeve inside of that, so as to create a liner that you can easily dispose of, or simply clean it. In terms of other practices, man, that's an interesting one. The other thing might be warming up thawing semen. And so how many straws do you thaw at one time? And it hasn't been a problem, but I have seen people throw I don't know, like 20 some straws in a thaw bath before. And the question you have to ask yourself is, in this case, are you decreasing the temperature in that water bath to influence the thawing temperature?
Yeah, no, great point. One of the questions that comes in is the data around shirt thaw. I know that was more of I think you guys were doing some in-house tests, but one of the viewers asked, would that be typical, what you would expect across the AI industry, about those same performance metrics or the same numbers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so those two studies, we did a total of 12 bulls, and we saw that 25% decrease. We have played around some with different straw formats and different extenders, and we see some even more variation from that. And so, to be frank with you, I don't know what would be standard. I mean, we can assume that based on what I've seen, that it's going to be a 25 to maybe 30% reduction in viability, and about the same or maybe a little bit greater motility. But how much range do we have? Well, like I said, I've just evaluated maybe 12 to maybe 20 bulls or so. So I don't really have a good idea on the variation we would see in that. But I can tell you this, is that everything that we do, whether we're measuring semen quality in terms of thaw method or just post-thaw evaluation, or whether we're talking about bull fertility, we have considerable bull-to-bull variation. So I would imagine that would apply across this technique as well.
Okay. And have you done any research in or looked at the use of using tweezers versus no tweezers when handling semen and the benefits thereof?
That's a great question. I have not, but I can walk you through it. So if you're not using tweezers, you're probably pulling the cane up further up towards the top of the tank, and so there could be some exposure concern there. And your fingers are fairly warm. Now, the crimp end should be up, and there should be a bubble at the top, so you're probably not coming into direct contact with semen using your fingertips. But once again, it kind of gets back to that graph I showed earlier. It probably isn't going to make all the sperm go belly up, or meaning they're all going to be immotile after doing this. I'm probably not going to see a difference in conception rate, but if you always work with best practice using tweezers if possible, it will probably help out over the long run.
Okay. And we've seen people, especially when doing it for flush work or IVF work, do multiple breedings. What are your thoughts on doing the multiple breedings even for just general conception? Do you feel that the effort and cost is worth it, or would you not notice a significant increase in conception rates? Do you theorize, or do you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. What you'll see on some of these larger dairies is you'll see people coming in. So let's say an animal's in heat this morning, and I breed her, and come back and breed. She's in heat the next day, and then I'll breed her again. And so I have no problem with that. Like I said, there is some flexibility. One of the things that's interesting is we don't know what the duration of sperm in the reproductive tract is. We're starting to figure some of that out based on the ability to measure the timing of ovulation relative to insemination, whether we're talking about activity systems or whether we're talking about, for example, using timed AI. But it can't hurt anything. Semen is depending on the bull you're using, kind of got to weigh it by costs open, but it's very common practice to rebreed if you bred 24 hours earlier and she's still in heat. In terms of how that relates to a superovulation scenario, it's a little different because you have a range of ovulation in that case compared to a single ovulation.
Yeah, no, and I was just referencing this and more for the one breeding I do, but the practice is quite common, obviously, in the superovulation with the multiple breedings. Another question that comes in is it worth the effort to breed twice a day, maybe AM, PM, versus a once a day breeding all the animals that you're presenting?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'm trying to think of data that would show that. I mean, you can look at some of these conception rates in these herds that are doing once daily breedings, and they're certainly acceptable, some up in the 40% range. And I'll be frank with you, I just can't think of data off the top of my head about that.
No problem. It's just one of the questions. Wondering if there was just like obviously it's a lot more labor intensive, but
Yeah,
there hasn't been any research to prove that
yeah, I feel
definitely the difference.
yeah, I feel like there is. I think you're right. I mean, if you're getting along fine with that's a question you got to ask about all of this. Maximizing reproductive efficiency, is the benefit worth the labor and the cost?
Yeah, and that leads into one of the other questions that came in, and it's more around the synchronization programs, because obviously some of them take a lot more labor than others. Are there ones that you would typically say are the most effective in relation to labor use for synchronization or sync programs?
Yeah, one of the ones that we see a lot is the pre-sync, and I've always talked about that because it gives you a really, within that type of program, it gives you, you'll have to be detecting estrus, but it gives you the ability to have one breeding before the time they eye. So you would have one shot of or one injection of prostaglandin, the first one inside of the voluntary waiting period, then one after, and that would be the one from which you would breed off of estrus. And then, of course, you have the timed insemination. But that's a great question. I can tell you that when you have a situation like double OvSynch, the question you have to ask is what's the difference between heat detection and going through and giving injections. And so you see a lot of herds that do the pre-sync protocols because they're going through there anyway, and you can get that extra breeding in. But there, in terms of like a protocol with double OvSynch where you have no estrus detection, you're still getting the injections, but you can still have considerably high conception rates if you comply and get all the injections in.
Okay, and then actually just on that line, another question comes in just now from viewer 13 is, what are some of the newest advancements in heat detection systems, pedometers, et cetera, that you see being implemented in the industry? What's next? Will the emphasis
So what's changed? When you look at the system, I'll give you what I know, and that's what I've known since I've been at Select. And we started off with the Select Detect system, which was activity-based, and we've worked with the SCR system, which includes activity and rumination monitoring, and then ultimately we've moved towards this ear tag system, which includes not only activity, rumination, but also it can measure temperature changes as well. So what I think this all is pointing to is it's not just about detecting estrus or detecting heat anymore. We will use these devices, of course, for that purpose, but we're also using them to really manage the cows and individuals. So we're gaining information from these devices about problems potentially during the transition period, reduced activity, or problems with rumination, illnesses, changes in ear temperature in the case of the ear tag system. So I think I think what we see now and what we'll continue to see is the use of activity systems, not just for reproductive management, but reproductive management is just really a one tool in the portfolio of the system to really track the cow as an individual.
Okay, great. One of the other questions that came in here, and I think you highlighted it, but maybe just go over it a bit again, is there a recommended voluntary waiting period that you have found that would maximize conception? So I think I remember you showing about that. 100
Yeah, I mean, like I said, what I have seen is the 70-day voluntary waiting period, 70 days in milk for first lactation animals, 60 days in milk for a second and greater, and that seems to work. And just to be frank with you, I'm not sure. I couldn't really tell you much more than what I've seen in that regard.
Okay, and then another one kind of comes in, especially around a hot topic these days, is have you noticed any differences in performance or these best practices when the use of all sexed ultra semen versus traditional, or has most of your research shown similarities between the two?
So we've Select Sires has been a partner with Sexing Technologies since the commercial release of the product, and we've continued to do research with Sexing Technologies to help improve their product. And what we found is in a research trial that we conducted with Sexing Technologies, we found an increase in conception rate compared to the old technique. It was about a 4.5 percentage point increase. So what we found basically is the research that ST has done and we've helped with. It's increased conception rate compared to the old method or the previous method that they used.
And would you say that semen handling and breeding practices would be the similar as with traditional semen, or is there practices that maybe you'd recommend differently, or adaptations maybe based on the difference in the semen?
No, one of the things we still suggest is the same, and if anything, maybe be more stringent in your semen handling. So the semen handling practices that I described for conventional semen should be followed with a sex semen as well. But if you think about sex semen, it may likely, or it's likely at a more of a compromised state compared to conventional semen, and so we would want to make sure that we maximize our handling.
Okay. One of the other questions that come here is, what do you feel will contribute greatest to improving fertility in dairy cattle in the near future? Management, heat detection, genomics, synchronization protocols. Where do you see the greatest advancements coming?
So we've done, when we talk about estrus synchronization, it's kind of interesting. My master's program, I was working with beef cattle in early 2000 when CEDARS became available, and it's amazing what we've done with ovulation, estrus synchronization, and basically ovulation synchronization. But we've become very, very good at synchronizing ovulation. So the question is what do we have to look forward to in the future? I think it'll be things that will decrease hassle factor and decrease animal handling and injections. Anything that we can do to maintain fertility and decrease that will probably be a path that we'll be going down eventually. Activity systems may be a part of that. But the other thing is the question of, well, we think that fertilization rate is fairly high. So even when you set up the proper timing of insemination relative to when these animals come to heat and ultimately ovulation, the question is well, what failures are there? So the question I would ask is, what can we do to increase embryo maintenance, or in other words, decrease embryo mortality before the time that we would see it with PAG tests or with ultrasound, and also some of the percentage of those animals that lose pregnancies during that period. So I think we'll see changes in management, and I think we'll also see changes or hopefully research and enabling us to understand why and hopefully mitigate some of the losses that we see with embryos. Yeah, and one thing, please, you'll notice my email address on the last slide, and of course at the beginning of the presentation. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to people. If there are any questions that you can think of or I didn't answer, sometimes you give me a couple of minutes, I may come up with a little bit better answer for you.
Yeah, no, and great, and that leads into what I was about to head into, and I want to thank you for taking the time to prepare a lot of this insightful information. To kind of some of the key takeaways I learned is, first of all, maximize your offer rate. I think it's an area that a lot of people, they may tell you what their conception rate is, but maybe haven't maximized their offer rate in there. The other thing I think the data kind of clearly states is that the water thaw method is the gold standard, as you mentioned, that it really is the highest best practice that we can work with in there. The use of a sheath, obviously, that bit of an eye-opener for some guys that maybe, hey, is it worth the headache? Do you do the time? But I think the data is nice to see there. And obviously the key message that you hammered home a few times is get that semen past the cervix. As someone who's done some breeding, not always the easiest to get it all done, but obviously that's the key point, is just get it in there, get the semen dropped in the right place, and obviously that's going to maximize results. So with that, I appreciate you taking the time to join with us today, and thank you, Matt, for doing that. And of course, the number one takeaway I learned today is that Donald Trump certainly gets a lot of cattle bred. So I appreciate that and hope everyone has a great day.
All right, take care.